Here we go. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a new installment of the TeTra series books in the spotlight. Today's book is Re-envisioning Theodore, Theodore of Mopsuestia's Biblical Exegesis in his Catechetical Homilies, published in 2024 by Brill in the VCS series. And it's my great pleasure to introduce the author, Sofia Puchkova, and the discussant, Samuel Fernández. To start with, Sofia Puchkova is currently a research associate in the ERC project Domestic Slavery and Sexual Exploitation, based at the University of Leicester, having previously been visiting scholar at the Wolfson College in Oxford and British Academy visitor in Durham. She defended her thesis in 2022 at KU Leuven, where we are colleagues for a long time, with a thesis that led to the book discussed today, and has broad interests in patristics and Syriac Christianity, on which she had already published several articles, as well as a translation of Theodore's homilies into Russian. Notably, Sofia recently won the Eusebius Prize from the Journal of Ecclesiastical History for her article, The Womb of Flame, the Pre-Christian Origins of a Greco-Syrian Baptismal Metaphor. And she was also awarded the Gerda Henkel Postdoctoral Fellowship for the following years, with a project on reading practices and local history in East Syrian manuscripts. And the discussant for the book in the spotlight today is Samuel Fernández. Samuel is professor in the Faculty of Theology at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He has published broadly in patristics, including a series of important critical editions, and more recently published a series of publications related to the Council of Nicaea. And I'd like to thank them both for being here today. Sofia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dan. And thank you, TeTra, for inviting me here to speak about my book. It's really a pleasure to be here again, because I already spoke about a different topic somewhere in 2021, I think, or something like really long ago. But I'm really glad to be back. And before I even start to speak about my book, which is here, I think it should be shown in a way, published in Vigiliae Christiana supplements. I would like to introduce my major protagonist, the protagonist of this book, Theodore of Mopsuestia. So as you may already know, since here is a really knowledgeable public, but maybe someone who will see us in the recording doesn't really know about Theodore of Mopsuestia, as just know the name, but not the person. And Theodore is let's say, early 5th century theologian and exegete and major representative of the Antiochian school. And I really used to compare Theodore to Augustine of Hippo, because they lived in the same period. Basically, they were contemporaries. But Theodore didn't like Augustine. He wrote treatise against Augustine's doctrine on original sin. But the thing is that they had something really in common, as in a way how they exercise the influence on some groups of Christians, like Augustine on the Western Christianity, and Theodore on the East Syrian Christianity. I think they are major figures in this case for these particular communities. So my book focuses mainly on one work of Theodore of Mopsuestia, that's Catechetical Homilies, and in particular the exegesis, biblical exegesis in his homilies. So just to be precise, we don't really have any other type of homilies from Theodore, just this the 16 catechetical homilies, and that's the only thing they have. But what pertains to the homiletical genre. And the question of genre, by the way, it's a rather leading question in my book. I argue that we should approach biblical patristic exegesis from the perspective of different genres, not only from the like the traditional, how we traditionally approach it from the perspective of biblical commentaries or exegetical homilies. So we should really look broader for the exegesis in different genres like catechetical homilies, moral homilies, homilies on the feast days and fasting days, letters and polemical treatises, apologetics, and so on and so forth. So I can continue endlessly. So all type of genre, and only in this way we can obtain this bigger picture of patristic exegesis, what it is, in fact. In my book, it's just one small step towards that broader picture of patristic exegesis. So if you, for instance, look at the other publications on Theodore of Mopsuestia, like recent publications, Hono Onry's book on Theodore's commentary on the minor prophets, or Miriam de Cock's work on a comparative study of Theodore of Mopsuestia commentary on the Gospel of John, and other commentaries on the Gospel of John, we can actually see that it's all about the commentaries again. And I would like to propose just to really look broader and to be open-minded to all type of exegesis we can actually find in late antique sources. That's one thing. Another thing, my book, however tiny and narrow it is, it's just 200 something pages, so it's not a huge book. It attempts a lot of things, and it attempts to challenge several assumptions, several limitations that exist in the scholarship on the patristic exegesis. In particularly to challenge that focus, that really limited focus on the studies of Alexandrian and Antiochian schools. So imagine then you yourself maybe experienced this, then you began to study patristic exegesis, you open some handbooks and you see Alexandrian school, Antiochian school. Alexandrians practice allegory, and then Antiochians practice some literal and historic exegesis, whatever it means. And it goes on and goes on. In the scholarship, we have a lot of trends really studying this particular dichotomy of these two schools. Some of scholars attempts to find some similarities between the schools, others on the other hand, just separate them as separate entities, arguing that every school has its own, let's say, peculiarities, and it's good on its own right, and so on. But my book actually tries to overcome this type of dichotomy and to look at the biblical exegesis in late antiquity from the perspective of a totally different network, the network of the Pro-Nicene theologians. And since Theodore of Mopsuestia was one of them, so I took Pro-Nicenes as a network like that my perspective on the Alexandrian and Antiochian schools deliberately, because Pro-Nicenes, it's a rather big, it's a big group. It's a big, diverse group that encompasses actually a different, let's say, variants of Christianity and Christian theology of 4th century. And the Homoousians, to whom Theodore belonged, is just one part of it. And so I deliberately took them all together as Pro-Nicenes, the people who are defenders of the Council of Nicaea, whatever they, and however they can understand the Nicaea. And this particular network, if you can look at the representatives whom I actually referred to, basically comprises people from scholars from Antiochian and Alexandrian schools. So it's basically, in a way, a network that unites both schools all together. And then we look at the exegesis of these theologians. Exegesis, I would say, again, the exegesis in the treatises, the polemical treatises. So the 4th century is the century of polemics. And there are a lot of exegesis going on in the polemical treatises. And when we look at that type of exegesis, we see that actually nobody bothered about methodology. what they operate, they do not operate with the methodology, allegory or literal methodology, whatever. They more think in the ways of exegetical traditions. So they use so-called exegetical traditions, the let's say stock interpretations, some common interpretive ideas, imagery, or just usages of the biblical verses in a particular theological context. So they used it all, these exegetical traditions, inside the network. So inside this big network of the Pro-Nicenes. And basically the Alexandrians and the Antiochians use the same exegetical traditions. Then it comes to theology, and then it comes to polemical treatises, and this kind of the commonality that the Pro-Nicenes actually shared. And I think it's also a way how we can look at the patristic exegesis and overcome this limitation of these two schools, and the focus on the methodology, just on the methodology, just to look at the exegesis from the perspective of other networks. And Pro-Nicenes, they are just surviving better, let's say. We have a lot of works of the Pro-Nicenes surviving, but we have less of, for instance, Eunomius network or Arian network. And these are also networks. We can imagine them like that, but we have little from Arian authors, for instance. But it would be great if they were. And then we can actually see and compare how different exegetical tradition may function in different theological networks. But the thing is that I just attempt to distance myself from that, let's say, the endless discussion of methodology and endless discussion of this dichotomy between two schools, to see something like a new perspective on the scholarship that exists today. That one thing. Another thing that I would like to say about my book, and what the main aim of this book was not exactly the argument about the Antiochian and Alexandrian schools, but it's about re-envisioning Theodore. So it's about attempting to create a new image of an exegete who has been already well studied. And that image that we have from Theodore of Mopsuestia, like what kind of exegete he was, we all have this information. We all have from the research on Theodore's commentary on the Bible, commentaries, like biblical commentaries. Again, one genre of biblical commentaries. And we know that he was a rather literalist, so he attended to the plain sense of the Bible. He was also very much attentive to the history of the Bible, and history meaning the narrative of the Bible, the sequence of the events described in the Bible, and also the factuality of these events. So Theodore really took the narrative of the Bible seriously. He, of course, could recognize metaphorical language in the Bible, some sort of non-literal things that's going on as well in the text. But he mainly very much attentive to the narrative of the Bible, and he's not keen on allegorizing it. So he doesn't like allegory as such. If it's not present in the some kind of metaphors or elevated meanings present in the biblical text, then Peter does not allegorize it. And then there's another part, like another side of this historical exegesis that Theodore proposed, is basically the interest in the biblical setting and context. So Theodore really interested in different chronologies of the Gospels, for instance, or he provides some setting for the Pauline letters or Psalms, and he's also very much attentive to the details of the Gospel narrative, and he interprets the Bible in the commentaries. But then it comes to the homilies, then everything turns wrong. It's just everything turns wrong. And the homilies actually gives a different insight into Theodore's exegesis. In the homilies, Theodore does not he's not interested in the narrative, not in the narrative itself, but in the setting of the narrative, like these details. He thinks that his catechumens perhaps don't really need to know all these details, but what he's interested in theology of the Bible. So, and his exegesis in the homilies, I labeled it as doctrinal, but it's really exposed a lot of theology, and it is interpreted, let's say it's created, this kind of exegesis with the help of Theodore's theology as a hermeneutical key. And I would argue that in the homilies, Theodore is much more flexible with regard to the setting of the Bible, and even with regard to the history of the Bible, that the narrative of the Bible. So he sometimes not really strictly follows it, and sometimes he kind of just twist it slightly if he needed for rhetorical reasons. At some point, he uses the stylistic figure of prosopopoeia. So it's a speech of like imaginary speech of a particular person, maybe a biblical character, and then Theodore introduces this prosopopoeia in the commentaries, and in the homilies, the result it might be very different. In the homilies, he follows the narrative of the Bible. So if Jesus speaks in the Gospels, and Theodore creates a prosopopoeia from the perspective of Jesus. And in the homilies, it might be totally different things. So it might be, for instance, that prosopoeia is basically from the perspective of the Son of God, the divine nature, not exactly like Jesus as a person, a human being, that it's a Son of God. Or maybe it's even the devil. So sometimes Theodore has prosopoeia. Once he introduces the prosopoeia from the perspective of the devil. It's like a speech of the devil, like a complaint about what Christ is doing. Christ came in order to drive out the devil from this world and condemn this world, and the devil actually complaining about these things. And the homilies just display this particular prosopoeia and no other type of prosopoeia at this particular verse of the Gospel of John. So it's Gospel of John 12:31, 32, as far as I remember. But my idea is that Theodore is much more flexible and creative in the homilies than it comes to the biblical exegesis than in the commentary. So he's not a slave of his own interpretive methodology. He can be flexible. He can accept variants sometimes if he needs, for instance, to say something important to his catechumens, to the living audience who is in front of him, because we are here with the catechetical homilies. So if he wants to influence them somehow in order to achieve a certain aim, so that they could force them, for instance, to learn the creed or to be enrolled for baptism or whatever. So it's just a matter of like pastoral and practical aims that Theodore pursued in his catechetical homilies, and exegesis is just the tool for gaining this aim, basically. And just to conclude, so my book is a certain really, let's say, a first attempt to scratch the surface of everything where it's possible. Because it's the first attempt to study Theodore's exegesis in the Catechetical Homilies, and then it's, in a way, first attempt to look at the Theodore's exegesis in non-exegetical genres. It's also a first attempt to look at Theodore's exegetical traditions, and also first attempt to, in a way, reevaluate these portrayal, re-envision Theodore as a historical exegete. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much for the illuminating introduction to your book and the world around it. And Samuel, please.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the invitation. For me, it's an honor to comment this book. I met Sofia time ago when she was in Leuven, then in Oxford, and well, we have been in contact, and therefore is really a pleasure. Well, some very general remarks first, and then I wish to comment like 1 or 2 pages of the book to raise some questions. First of all, well, it's a very clear book. The structure is very well done, and she presents the methodology, and she followed the methodology. And the other thing that I think is very important is that the book allows Theodore of Mopsuestia to speak through quoted passages. Sometimes we read quite systematic ways of presenting authors, and you don't know if you are talking or not with the author himself. The 3 levels of analysis are well defined and consistent within each homily among Theodore's works, and the broader context, Greek and Syriac literary context. And the interpretation of the text is very precise, and this is absolutely crucial for this kind of works. The book provides with valuable contributions, and well, Sofia spoke about what is, in my view, the main one, and is to show that the interpretation of the Bible depends not only in schools but on literary genre. This is very important because as far as the fragmentary character of our documentation of early Christianity, for example, many authors involved in the Arian crisis, we have their polemical works, but not their exegetical works. We have only fragments which are engaged in this theological controversy and so on. And then we tend to think that they were literalists because we only know this polemical exegesis, and obviously in a polemical setting you cannot start to create allegories and so on, but you have to be very careful with the text and so on. And then Sofia shows us that the literary genre is crucial to understand the way the different authors understand the Bible, and not only the exegetical schools. And therefore, the book challenges the classical historical versus allegorical interpretation of the Bible. And this is something very, very important. It's like a step forward. And the last thing, and I wish to speak about this, is the book shows that the understanding of the scriptures depend on theological principles and on exegetical techniques. That is, this relationship between understanding, principles, and techniques, I think is really interesting. And then I will go to one example to raise some questions and to start the conversation. And then in page 64, there is a quotation in which Theodore uses Isaiah 44:6 to stress the unity of God, that is monotheism. And in the following page, that is in page 65, Sofia says the following: the fact that many Old Testament quotations corroborate Theodore's monotheistic statement shows the influence of his theory of progressive revelation, that is, the theory, the principle, a theological principle, that is a way of understanding revelation in a progressive way, so to say, determines the way he will understand the text. Well, And then the monotheistic statement shows the influence of his theory of progressive revelation, according to which the prophets of ancient Israel did not know God in three hypostases, and only Christ revealed God as Trinity. Therefore, for Theodore, Old Testament quotations cannot corroborate teaching on the Trinity or the divinity of the Son and the Spirit. According to Theodore's logic, Old Testament quotation can only be used in order to support monotheism, because the Old Testament prophets knew only one God. And then I think this is a very interesting remark on the text of Theodore. Please, Dan, if you can share the screen. The first text is the quotation of Theodore by Sofia, and it says, because of this, he said, I am the first God, and there was created no other God before me, and there shall be no other God after me. This is the quotation of the prophet. In order that we can understand that he is the God who was first and from eternity, and that it is impossible that another God that is created should exist. Divine nature is more elevated than creation. Yeah. Well, this quotation was understood by Theodore, as Sophia said, in this framework of his way of understanding the process of revelation. That is, God revelated as only one God in the Old Testament, and only in the Gospels, that is, with Jesus, that is, God reveals himself as Trinity. I guess whether we have Old Testament, the Synoptic Gospel, and then we have John, because there is also a difference between the Synoptic and John, according to Theodore. And then the way of understanding revelation determines the way Theodore understood the scripture. And in this text, I think that he's stressing the unity of God, as Sophia said, and there is an anti-Gnostic idea. No? It is not possible to think about created gods. That is, a God that comes from God, like Arius said. No? And then the theological setting determines the way he understood the text. Then we have the second quotation is, we are going back, no? Is the Synod of Sirmium. This synod was against Marcellus of Ancyra and Photinus. Photinus was a disciple of Marcellus. And then they had the idea that the Logos of God was a faculty of God, not a subsistent being. And then there is only one God, and one God who is rational, and therefore the Logos exists eternally. But this Logos was not someone, but a faculty of God, something. And then the text says, if anyone takes the saying, I, God, am first, and I am after these things, and besides me there is no God, which was said to deny the idols and those that are not gods, to deny in the Jewish manner the only begotten God's existence before the age, let him be anathema. Well, the text is very interesting because it's the same quotation by of the prophet, and the canon, this text shows two different understandings. The canon rejects the understanding of Marcellus of Photinus, who used this text to reject the subsistence of the Son. That is, the same quotation of Isaiah was used by Theodore to stress the unity of God, by Marcellus to reject the subsistence of the Son, and the authors of the Synod of Sirmium, that is Basil of Ancyra and George of Laodicea, they say the true meaning is that this text rejects the pagan gods, that is, stress the unity of God. And lastly, there is a quotation by Hippolytus of Asia Minor. This is not Hippolytus of Rome, but the author of Contra Noetum, and he says he is against Noetus, who was we could say Sabellianist, although we know very little about Sabellius, but like the label is Sabellianist. He says, now when they try to provide a confirmation, that is Hippolytus is speaking against Noetus. Now when they try to provide confirmation of their doctrine, they say, said in the law, I am God of your fathers, you shall have no other gods besides me. And again, in another place, it says, I am the first, I am the last, and beside me there is none. In this way, they claim to confirm that there is one God. They answer questions by saying, so then, if I confess that Christ is God, then he is the Father, if he is God. That is, well, Noetus uses the same text, but this time to prove, that is to identify the Son and the Father. And then in these three texts, we have at least 4 different interpretations that depend on the theological context. And then what I wanted to highlight is that Sofia put the emphasis on the theological context, the theological principles that guided the way of understanding the scripture in the homilies of Theodore. And then I think that the book provides a very interesting, that is a very insightful material to reflect and to discuss how there is this these 3, so to say, 3 elements are related. That is the relationship between the understanding of the scripture, the theological principles, in this case, the way that is the way he understands the revelation, and the exegetical techniques. This last point, and these are my last words, the point about the exegetical techniques is also really important, because this theory of progressive revelation is also set in a particular context. That is, the authors of the Christian authors of the 2nd and 3rd century, as they were threatened by Marcion and the Gnostic and so on, they need to show that the Old Testament is a Christian book. The Old Testament speaks about the Trinity. The Old Testament speaks about Christ and about his humanity and divinity. But as the Gnostics and Marcion was no longer a threat for the Old Testament, then Theodore can affirm this theory of the progressive revelation and say that only the one God is revealed in the Old Testament. Well, these are more questions than answers, but I think that a good book is a book that raises questions, and this is what we wish to discuss now. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you so much to our author, Sofia, for her presentation, and to our respondent, Samuel Fernández, for the questions, for the insightful response. I think perhaps Sofia might now first like to respond, and then afterwards we will open the floor for more general questions from all of you.
Thank you so much, Samuel. It's so good to see you first here, and then to listen to your very kind response on my book. I would say yes. I totally agree that progressive revelation theory is something rather central for Theodore's understanding of Old Testament and Old Testament theology, and I would argue even that this is why he doesn't really use so much Old Testament quotations in his Catechetical Homilies, because he preached on Trinity and Christ's two natures, and the quotations from the Old Testament doesn't really serve here for his aim to corroborate his Trinitarian theology or Christology. So it's basically, yes, it's basically about the monotheism. When he speaks about one God, he recalls something from the Old Testament. That's certainly true. And I was really intrigued by seeing how the meaning of the same quotation actually changed from like without centuries and from one place to another place. And I would even argue that perhaps Theodore's understanding of that, the Isaiah 44, that was basically close to the understanding of the fathers of the Council of Sirmium, in a way that he also argues that that's against false gods. So it's against pagan gods. It's against, perhaps he may thought about Manichaeans, and yeah, because Antiochian area is quite populated by Manichaeans as well, and perhaps he had this in mind as well. So thank you for making this comparison. It's really tricky to find these sources, but to see how one passage really evolves through the several centuries of Christianity, that's amazing. Thank you.
Mm.
It is now my pleasure to open the floor for questions and comments from all other participants. Please feel free either to raise your virtual hand or to write your question in the chat, and we can read it out for you. And perhaps to start us off, Sofia, could I ask you the first question?
Sure.
I was intrigued by your proposal to sort of leave aside the standard Antiochian Alexandrian dichotomy and sort of creating a new network, or looking at a new network of Pro-Nicenes. And you mentioned that as a broad and diverse group that shares a lot of SOC versus SOC images from the Bible. And I was curious if you would expect, if I could ask you to speculate for a moment, if you would expect this to be very different for other networks that existed and ones that were not preserved as much as you mentioned. So, for example, Eunomian networks or Arian networks. Would you expect those to use very different images or verses, or would you rather expect on that level too to see a kind of broad overlap with what you have shown for the Pro-Nicene group?
Yeah, thank you, Marian, for this interesting question. Basically, I definitely would expect the use of the same verses, of the same biblical proof text, because they are used just without the controversy, such texts as John 10:30, for instance, or John 1:1. So it's just it's all about interpretation. So then I think about the networks and the exegetical traditions that the networks may be using. So it's just about the ways how they use them, and it's the way, it's basically what kind of stock interpretations they have on the one particular verse. Might be different interpretations inside different networks, but on the same verses. So I would expect eunomians, for instance, interpret John 10:30 in a different way than, for instance, the major Pro-Nicenes interpret the same verse. So it's not about the quality of the Son and the Father, or not about the conceptuality of the Son and the Father, definitely, but it's about something else. We can imagine just a different interpretation. So it's a tricky thing, because at that point, Bible certainly was a certainly contested book. You may argue for that. It's just about the ways of people saw the same texts, and the different networks can see them differently. I didn't really mention that in the book itself, but I've recently discovered a pretty good, let's say, term for the networks, the Pro-Nicene network, or Alexandrians and Antiochians. These are interpretive communities. I think it's a really good term. So it's basically it's slightly out of your question, but I forgot to mention that then I spoke, because I think it's good to mention it here, because this term interpretive community, like local interpretive community in case of Alexandrians and Antiochians, and then we think about like really cross Mediterranean interpretive community as Pro-Nicenes, who share the similar theology, similar interests, and similar exegetical traditions in a way. And you may imagine there are many types of these interpretive communities, Arian interpretive community as well, but we don't really know much about it.
Thank you so much. Very interesting. And also thank you for going beyond the book, maybe giving us a glimpse into a potential future book.
Yeah.
The next question is by Dan.
Thank you very much both for introducing us to all these topics. I have a quick question about Theodore, out of ignorance. How does he discuss the or approach the minor Catholic epistles? It's a general question, because you get that dynamic in Syriac where the Peshitta does not include them.
Yeah.
You only get the major. That's the space in which major Catholic epistles and minor has sense with these expressions. Do you know of anything about that? Is he ever recurring to the minor ones by any chance? And I'll double it with a similar sort of question, which relates to something Samuel says. That Theodore plays in different spaces and different places, John on the one hand and the synoptics on the other. Maybe you could explain something of that as well, either of you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. First, the first question. So basically, nowhere in the homilies Theodore interprets minor Catholic epistles, and even mention them or even cite them or anyway. And we know that in other works he also didn't do it. So we assume that perhaps they were just not a part of the Antiochian biblical canon. As for instance, Book of Revelation was not a part of the Antiochian canon, and like his Syrian Peshitta as well. So it's just at that point, at the late 4th, early 5th century. So it basically may be the case of the canon. It's not the case that Theodore just rejected this type of books as uncanonical, as then someone claimed in the later centuries Theodore did. Then Theodore was condemned at the Council of Constantinople. There were such accusations that he just rejected some books of the canon because he just had his own. He was so proud, and had his own opinion on everything. Yeah, but getting to your second question about the Gospel of John and other Gospels. So what do we have from Theodore? So we have almost like fully preserved commentary on the Gospel of John in Syriac. And then we have remains of many remains of Theodore's commentary on Matthew and Luke in Greek. Quite many, I would say, but still not enough to really construct a normal impression about his commentary on the Gospel Gospel of Matthew. But in the homilies, it looks like John is really prominent. And there are many, like much more quotations from the Gospel of John than from other Gospels. And looks like he is more interested, Theodore is more interested in John, and uses John for just to corroborate his Trinitarian doctrine, his Christology. So it looks like he uses other Gospels, just then he didn't find the proper passage in John. They are kind of very much auxiliary in this way. So just something additional, extra. Yeah, so it's yeah, then it comes to such a gospel as a Mark's gospel, so he didn't use it at all. So but it's not surprising, because you know that many patristic authors just somehow disregard Mark as such.
They go to the more complex, complete text, to fuller accounts in.
Yes, yeah, I imagine.
And does he use the major Catholic epistles? Mentions them?
He uses them somewhere. Perhaps, yeah. He has quotations from some of them in other works. In the homilies, I don't quite remember, so I didn't record it, that particular fact. He certainly didn't comment on them. Perhaps he cited some, but maybe First Peter somewhere, but he's just left it. Certainly they were not in his kind of scope of interest, let's say. Paul is certainly in his scope of interest, but the rest is just falling into something oblivion.
And if to follow up with the question, do we know what type of New Testament text did he use?
Yes, because there is a study on the quotations in Theodore's homilies, and it looks like it's a very particular Antiochian text. So it's not like a Pishita thing, or even not close to that, not Septuagint, if it comes to the Old Testament, for instance. So it's a local version, let's say, of the like Antiochian Antiochian Septuagint, but the some New Testament from the same region, let's say. So it's very local.
Do we
quite
have
interesting.
manuscripts for that local Antiochian text, or is something postulated because several authors in that area seem to use the biblical text in the same way, which is different from others? Or do we have manuscripts with that?
I'm not aware of that, so unfortunately, it's not my
Yeah, no worries.
province, really.
Sorry,
It's okay.
I wondered though.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Any final questions or comments for Sofia, or based on the conversation of Sofia and Samuel? If not, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Sofia, for giving us a much more complex picture of Theodore and for putting him into dialogue with figures from whom he is often thought to differ. And thank you so much to Samuel Fernández for your perceptive comments. Thank you all for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.